Welcome to Life on Life's Terms podcast. This is your host, Justin, and this episode is a solo show about reforming from the corrections program or system here in Canada. My topic this month was restorative justice, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the restorative justice that I experienced going through the system some years ago or some time ago. I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that I've seen in my own personal experience with it and some of the things that I have seen from those that I've worked with who are going through this system. And I'm also going to talk about some of the good stuff that I've seen currently in the system and some of the things that just are appalling within the system. So first off, I would like to have a big shout out to all of those probation officers and parole officers who really do care about their air quotes clients and really are trying to help them get out of the system and maybe get into more of a positive situation in their life. So I'm going to kick off by talking a little bit about my history with, in regards to being arrested and give you a little bit of a picture of what it looked like as I was going through the system. So my first time ever really being charged, I was in a place in Ontario. I got caught with some ecstasy, some marijuana, some pot, and a shoplifting charge. I got what was called diversion court. I was over the age of 18, and what this ended up doing was this gave me like basically a free pass. I had to do some community service in like a Goodwill or something like that. Really sucked. That really did suck. And I got off those charges and carried on my merry way in active addiction. I was just basically an alcoholic and an active user at that time, really just trying to exploit my addiction as much as I possibly could while justifying it by saying I only party on the weekends, as opposed to saying that, I'm basically a fuck up, because that's really what I was at that time. And so what ended up happening from there was, I had to make my collateral damage come back to Alberta. And so I came back to Alberta here in Edmonton and was breaking bad again, so to say. And I got caught the first time real quick with possession for the purpose charge. So what that basically means is that I had enough drugs or a quantity of drugs on me to be a drug dealer, and they had me surveillanced into a point where it might be likely that I was a drug dealer. Didn't mean that they couldn't charge me with drug dealing. That would be trafficking. But they might have had enough. Evidence to suggest that I was a drug dealer, especially with the amount of drugs I had on me. Plus, I got caught with 2 sawed-off shotguns, also in the supposed house that I was in, and one was loaded, one wasn't loaded. If you've ever listened to my bio, the reason why that was because I had, the night before my arrest, I had tried to commit suicide with the one that wasn't loaded, and these guns were both identical. They both had the buttstocks on. However, the barrels were cut down so that I could fit it in my mouth. And the one that wasn't loaded, I knew I had tried to use and obviously was unsuccessful, because here I am sitting here talking to you today, some years later. And the one that was loaded was to signify to me that I hadn't tried that one yet. And the night that I was arrested, I had intended to basically go out and try another suicide attempt that night. I can tell you that ballistics from my trial suggests that both guns work. So why I'm still here is a miracle in itself, if you believe in miracles, as I do. So then what ended up happening from that point on was I was booked, and there were some other charges, but there's no point in talking about those ones. They ended up being dropped. I was booked, and then I went to this to the remand center, which is basically a center here in Edmonton or in any town where you will wait to, try to get bail from a lawyer. Get bail from a judge. And what ended up happening was we went in, and I waited, I think, 2 weeks to speak to bail, or about a week and a bit. I ended up getting a substantial amount of money for bail. Like, it was like tens of thousands of dollars. They gave me bail at tens of thousands of dollars. And I was out within like pretty quick. So I got out of jail and went back to Breaking Bad and tried to lay low. However, the raging addict that I was, what ended up happening was I got picked up again within 9 months and went back into jail again for my second possession for the purpose charge, which that day I actually was not selling drugs. Later on, you'll see why that is so prevalent when I say I wasn't selling drugs, because I really was not selling drugs that day. Anyways, this second time, I had enough of a record, I guess, that they could keep me. I think the reason why they only let me out the first time was because they wanted to see who I knew. They as being the police officers. So they wanted to see who I knew and where I fit within the structure of everything and all that stuff. And so the second time I was picked up, and this time they were not giving me bail. Now, I can remember the first time that I was in the old remand center here in Edmonton, and we have a new remand center. I vowed that I would never go into the new remand center. However, I can tell you I've been in the new remand center. And I remember even the time when I was in the old remand center, the quickness of my institutionalization within that place. It was very, very quick. And it was really, really shitty. I mean, I couldn't believe how fast I was on the clock, how fast I was in the schedule of things, how quickly I was looking for the food to come out the 3 times a day, all that stuff. And when I got out, man, I just partied. I fucking ripped and ran. You know, that's what I did. That I was on the way, you know. And it was a pretty crazy ride coming out. I think the second time I got arrested, I had this girl staying with me, and she actually called the police on herself because we were all basically fucked up on meth for about a week, and we had some pretty serious rough sex the night before, and she ended up having her period the next day, and she thought that she was all cut up or something. She's also a prostitute. I was pimping at the same time. And she thought she was all cut up inside, and she really wasn't. She was just having her period. She called the ambulance on herself. The ambulance went into the house, and I mean, it was a party house. Like, there's fucking drugs everywhere with booze everywhere. So they weren't even going to help her. They called the police because they had entered the apartment. I actually ended up grabbing her from the apartment and drove her to the hospital and made her check herself in, and never went back to the apartment for a while. I'm pretty sure that the detectives were then called to that address, and that address for sure on my probation sheet had my address. I also remember that time when I was on like bail probation. So basically that from the first time I was arrested to the second time I was arrested, they basically make you check in with a probation officer. I remember this one time I was checking in with probation, and I was like literally at 24 hours late. I fucked up the date, and it was like Tuesday at noon or some shit, and I showed up on a Wednesday at noon, coked out of my mind and just fucking loaded. And how that probation officer didn't throw me back in jail, I don't know. I mean, I probably should have went back to jail. I was basically a fucking degen right then and there at that moment. And I was amazed that I was not going back to jail. I remember going back to my vehicle going, fuck, that was a close call, you know? And so anyways, fast forward a little bit to my second time getting arrested, and here I am going to the new remand, and I already knew the process. You know, I remember the first time I was arrested, I didn't know the process of getting booked and put in. I mean, the other times, like in Ontario when that had happened, I was basically so belligerently drunk that it didn't really matter. I didn't know how any of that was going down. And this time I was definitely not getting a promise to appear, what we call as an acronym, a PTA. I was for sure going in, and I knew I was going to be going in for a while on the second one. I thought I was going to be going in for a while on the first one, but I remember my lawyer telling me even murderers, Justin, get bail. You're going to get bail. Don't worry about it. We'll have you sprung in just a little bit here. Hold tight. And this second time, that was not happening. I was probably, well, not even probably, I for sure was going in for some time. And so there I am in jail, went for bail a couple times and nothing was happening. I ended up losing my lawyers because of money issues. And then I ended up getting legal aid, and a half decent lawyer through legal aid, I must say. So then when that all happened, basically what was told to me was I was fucked. I wasn't getting anything for bail until like I might as well just sit tight for trial. I remember sitting in the jail, and I was in the old remand center, the new remand center at this time. I basically slept for like 2 weeks. I didn't even come to really until I was sentenced to a place called Fort Saskatchewan Correctional Center. And when I was in the Fort Saskatchewan Correctional Center, I can tell you that that's really when I started thinking about my case. And I remember one of the biggest feelings I had was, okay, Justin, I'm ready to leave now. And the recognition of, you're not leaving. That acceptance was really difficult to take when you realize, like, you're not free. And I thought of ways like, how can they blow up the wall, and how the fuck can I get out of here? And there just was no way of getting out. It wasn't happening. And like I said, I finally came to at the Fort Saskatchewan Correctional Center. And when I finally came to at that place, that's when I started working with my lawyer trying to get out. Now, like I said, his suggestion was to me, Justin, look, you're fucked for trial. Like you're going to trial. That's what's going to happen here. And this was about probably 4 or 5 months of dead time. So when I mean dead time, that means like time that's not going to be going towards my sentence. And it's also time that I'm just sitting around waiting for a trial. So I was sitting in this place, and I'm going to explain this place to you. Most of the cells are individual cells. There's about 4 cells in the entire unit that have double cells. And this is usually your inception into the unit, which means you're going to have a roommate for the first X amount of time. And then you get yourself on a list in order to go into a single cell. Single cells are beneficial if you like solitary time. However, if you like to play cards with somebody and all that stuff, then that's not the cell for you. The other thing about this particular correction facility is the lights are never off. So even at night, the lights are still on. The mat on your bed is probably half the width of your hand. You get your sheets, you get your one pillow, and you had to wear like a jumpsuit, not the orange jumpsuits. They had like the blue jumpsuits where the sleeves still didn't cover your entire arm. So your wrists were always bare. And it was a charge if you slept in your bed just in your underwear. They only gave you tighty whities. They didn't give you boxers. You had to buy those boxers. The other thing about this particular institution here in Canada was a pair of jogging pants and a jogging shirt and a white t-shirt that you would buy at Walmart cost you $100 in the institution, which is very, very expensive, right? And people would fight you for it. They fucking stab you for those kinds of clothes in the system. So this is all what's going down. And what I also recognized very, very quickly as I was in this institution is that I was a minority, being a Caucasian male in Canada. Like I was I was a minority within the entire jail. There was a different culture that was the majority within that jail. And that was different for me, being in that microcosm. And also within that jail system, like I said, the lights were never off. You were only allowed three 5-minute phone calls a day that were free, like I said. And I talked to my mom didn't even know that I was in jail for the first 3 months, I think. And then I finally told her, and from what I was told is my mother ended up having basically a heart attack after I told her I was incarcerated again. And she obviously did not take it very well. And she didn't even want to talk to me in the beginning when I was in that situation, which was right around Christmas time. Well, actually, it was August 15, 2013 is when I was arrested. That's also my clean date. And so from there, I think my mom finally found out that I was incarcerated by like October or November. And when I was also in jail, I realized that it might be beneficial for me to start talking to a psychologist. And so I started talking to a psychologist. I was also told about drug court and that maybe they might take me. I had applied a couple times to drug court, but they wouldn't actually accept me because of the gun charges and the known associations that I had. So drug court was not an option for me. Even though I had been through diversion court, I was probably a low risk offender. Aside from what my charges were. Then what ended up happening, so like my options are running short, right? That was the kicker. My options were running short. And like I said, I started working with a psychologist because I did recognize that I had some serious issues that were wrong with my behaviors. I did recognize that I felt like the world owed me something. I was born poor. You know, I was going to go get mine. I was going to break bad, do whatever the fuck I had to do in order to take care of my family, take care of my needs, all of those things. And I wasn't going to subject myself to what society said I was entitled to. I wanted more. And I was willing to work for it in a way that was outside of the scope of law because I basically thought that that was, you know, being like a political refugee, saying that, you know, the system sucks and I don't want to conform to it, and why the fuck should I pay taxes and vote? I was really trying to fight the system. And so as I was going through all of this, the institutionalization when I was in there was unreal. I saw an inmate raped in front of me in a provincial system, and he was not raped by inmates. He was actually raped by one of the guards in that facility. We would have guards turn the lights on in the middle of the night and play like fucked up white noise throughout the cells. We had one particular guard where if he caught somebody masturbating in a cell, he would basically turn the PA system on to everybody in the unit and, like, you know, make fun of him to 80 men, you know. You were always told, get in your fucking kennels, shit like that. By the guards, the COs would treat us just horribly. The thing I think to recognize with these particular correction officers is that they were trained as military security guards for a place like Afghanistan, and then they transitioned into the correction facility for Alberta Corrections or the Solicitor General of Alberta in order to be a corrections officer for like Fort Saskatchewan or the remand centers or like that job when they came back to, air quotes, civilization. And so they knew a lot of the mental tactics that were employed within that area, and they would then use them as discretion in this particular facility called Fort Saskatchewan Correctional Center. We would have guards beat the living shit out of some of the inmates. I mean, they throw them in the back of the van and just fuck their world up. And the guards would get away with this with like great impunity, man. It didn't matter. They had the goon squad, so to say, and these guys would come in and they would just fuck your world up. They would mace you in the face and put boots to your face, you know, just fuck you up while you're on the ground, handcuffed. And I remember like one of the worst parts of this entire process was getting shakedown in the cell blocks. They would come in and they would throw everything out of your cell into the hall, you know, out into the common area, and they would strip you down naked and, you know, look up your asshole and the whole bit. And it was just, it was fucking horrible, man. Like, to always be afraid that these guys were, or always in the back of your mind thinking that these guys were going to come in and fuck your world up and like toss your cell and like all this shit just fucking sucked, man. Like, it just sucked. In my particular case, there was a rumor that went around that was unfavorable to me, and some of the inmates were going to hurt me because they had said that I was, something that I wasn't. And I remember, some guy was going to try to stab me or whatever because of this supposed rumor. And the guards literally said, look, if this guy did what you think he did, we would have told you so that you would have got rid of him. So that says a lot in itself, right? I mean, the guards themselves are, like basically telling inmates, this guy's a no good, fucking do him in. I mean, that's really who runs the cell. That's really who runs the institution, is the guards. I also remember at one time when I was in that institution, we lost our commissary for a week. And the reason why we lost our commissary for the week was because the girl who was bringing in commissary, who was actually running the store in the jail, got caught bringing in heroin and drugs in like the Cheeto bags and stuff, and she was resealing them and shit. And I don't believe she was ever charged. The other thing that's a known fact in this particular prison is the guards themselves get sucked off by the female inmates, and then the inmates end up giving the female inmates drugs in order for it. And the guards won't actually sleep with any of the female inmates because they don't want to get them pregnant. So instead they'll get blowjobs from these female inmates. And then the female inmates in turn pass off the drugs to some of the male inmates within that jail. I mean, this jail is incredibly, incredibly backwards, man. I mean, it's crazy to think how corrupt this one place is. And I mean, I'm sure there are people who are listening to this podcast saying, well, you know what? If you didn't do shitty things, you wouldn't be in a shitty place. However, is that really punishment? These things that these guards are doing within the microcosm of the institution, is that really a part of the punishment that we as society dictated that somebody needs to go through for their crimes? I would suggest not. I mean, the fact that you're away from your family, the fact that you're away from your family, the fact that you can't choose what you want to eat, the fact that you have to wear a jumpsuit, the fact that you're only allowed 3 phone calls a day is what the state institutes as punishment enough. And then these guards in this particular place decide to impress upon more of a punishment in regards to what the government has imposed, or what the state has imposed upon the inmates that are within that particular facility. Also, what was difficult to handle, and I've said this before in other podcasts, but I'll say it again, is I remember there was an instance where something had happened in the middle of the night and they locked down the unit. And I remember waking up one morning and my door was locked. And in this particular facility, you had to buzz in order to get out to go to the bathroom. So you basically buzzed the guards to let you out so that you go to the bathroom, because there was not a bathroom in our cells. Now, what I found out later on by rules is they're actually not supposed, our cell doors were supposed to be open until lockup all of the time. We were never supposed to be locked in our cell because of that bathroom. We had to have access to the bathroom. That's actually unconstitutional as well, keeping somebody from bathroom privileges. So, I mean, that was a big issue that was always overlooked within that institution. You could write to what we call an ombudsman, but the ombudsman would just basically say, yeah, you were wronged, and they would move on, and nothing would actually ever happen because of your complaint. It just always fell upon deaf ears because, you're an inmate. And like I said, there's probably people who are listening to this show saying, well, you're an inmate and you did shitty things in order to be there. And I mean, granted, but how long can you hold your piss for? Because in this particular situation that I'm going to tell you, I waited, morning piss, I waited 3.5 hours before they let me out. and ended up having to urinate within my garbage can that was in my cell. Or guys would often urinate within like the bottles, like Gatorade bottles, because guards wouldn't let them out so that they could go to the bathroom. And this is, I mean, that's horribly wrong, to have to wait to go to the bathroom. I mean, the Edmonton Remax Supermaxes have like the bathroom in the cell. That's why this particular institution, you're not supposed to be locking people up in this particular institution for longer than an hour at a time, because they have to be able to move freely towards the bathroom if they have to go. Could you imagine being sick in your cell and they won't, and you have the runs or the shits or whatever, and they don't allow you to go to the bathroom because you're on lockdown? Like, you're basically going to make a mess in your cell. And then who has to clean that up? You do. They're not doing fuck all for you, right? So I think in this entirety, what ends up happening is you get more of a resentment towards the state, right? You get more pissed about it because, at every corner, your basic human decency is taken away, such as using the bathroom. I don't think anybody really thinks that should be a part of punishment. Defecating in your own fucking cell and having to sit in it and smell it. At least when you have a toilet in your cell, you can flush it and it can go away. So enough about the bathroom situation in this particular institution. The other thing that was impressed upon me while being institutionalized was always walking around with your hands behind your back. And this was so that the guards could see it, or if you were a prolific offender, you had to walk with your hand on the wall. And this was so that they could see your hands and know that you were not a threat to anybody. What I did find was that these kinds of rules that were imposed upon people, sure, they were to help the guards stay safe, only because, in my opinion, the guards had created such a shitty environment that at any chance the inmates would have started a controversy with the guards, at any moment. And like I said, a lot of that is just look at some of the environment that I've been so descriptive in just in the last 10 minutes or so. These are the things that held true to my PTSD later on in regards to my institutionalization. So I remember also being in this prison and trying to be released. And I had a hell of a time getting released. One, I have no family in Alberta. Secondly, I had no place to really go to. I was essentially homeless the second I was released. And I also remember one of the guards saying, "I really hope you're the one guy that I never see back in here." And I think that was because at that point in time, I'd become a air quotes model inmate. I did my own time, like I said, and I did start talking with a psychologist. Long of the short of it, the system at about 9 months decided that they would let me out, provided that I would go to treatment. Now, because when I was let out, there was nowhere for me to go, I ended up going into a very, very risky situation with people who were still in active addiction. I can tell you by the grace of God, I did not use drugs while waiting 30 days to go to treatment. And in that amount of time, I realized very, very quickly that I could stay sober in jail, but being sober in the outside world was a whole new story. It was just completely different. In the microcosm or the environment of the institution, I actually felt safe. And I'll say this, I'll talk about a bit about the day that I was released. So I basically was invited to, in the Catholic faith, we have what's called Holy Thursday. which is the Thursday before Good Friday. However, they couldn't give it to us on the Thursday, so they gave us a Holy Tuesday Mass. I went to the Holy Tuesday Mass, and as soon as I got back to my unit after Holy Tuesday Mass, I was bailed out. I don't still know to this day who it was that bailed me out. But I did get bail about 2 weeks prior to that Mass. But I think that this particular instance will paint a very clear, vivid picture of how deep institutionalization becomes. So I get bail, and I had to call those people who were in active addiction to come pick me up, which was arranged because that was really the only place that I could go to being released. I called them at about 11:30 midnight, and they were in a place called Kalmar, Alberta, which was on the southwest side of Edmonton. My conditions were so tight that it even dictated which way they had to drive to bring me back to their house. Okay, they had a route that was planned out. And so anyways, I called these people late at night, and they were way too intoxicated to come pick me up that night. And they said, well, can we come pick you up tomorrow morning? And I knew that the rule was the second that I had bail, I really wasn't allowed back into the jail. But there was really nowhere for me to go. And so the next day, that night, the guards allowed me to go back into my cell. I remember thinking to myself that thank God I get to stay home for one more night. And I had a hard time leaving, like a hard time sleeping that night. I ended up packing up all my stuff, but I kept thinking to myself, how fucked up is this situation that this place is my home? And that was even now as I talk about it, man, I'm pretty stricken with emotion because I can't fathom how fucked up that is. Or how shitty that is for anybody to have to go through, thinking like that place is your house, that place is your home, and how comfortable you can become living in an environment of the environment that I just talked about. It almost becomes a Stockholm syndrome type of situation with the institution and the guards around you. And the next morning, I remember walking out of the jail, and I was so timid and scared. You have no idea how afraid I was. I was so afraid to just leave. And I remember feeling that fresh air on my face that was outside of those prison walls, and feeling and tasting freedom, knowing that I couldn't even get a Tim Hortons coffee. I hadn't had percolated coffee in like 9 months, just instant coffee. I remember too the smell that the smell of like fast food off the guards' clothes, and how much that would affect you while you were in the institution, or when they would bring in Tim Hortons or percolated coffee into the unit, and you haven't had any of that in months. And yeah, I mean. I'll take that on as part of a punishment. However, you know, it was difficult to handle those kinds of things in the moment. And yeah, so anyways, here we are going to my friend's place. And long and the short of it, I hung out there for about 30 days and finally I went actually and stayed with a friend who was a convict, like an ex-con, somebody that I met in jail for 2 or 3 days prior to going to this treatment center called Henwood that I was released to. And as this situation was happening and unfolding, I was really afraid to go to treatment. I also remember when I was staying with that friend in active addiction, I had a serious outburst where I lost my shit. I don't even know how to explain it. It was almost like just a breakdown of losing my mind. I just lost my mind. I started flailing around, and the PTSD was just so much that I didn't even know. I guess, so the way how the situation worked out was I woke up and I realized I wasn't in a cell and I didn't know where I was anymore. And I was so gripped by the PTSD, I couldn't get off the air mattress that was on the floor, and I just started flailing around. I lost my shit. And these people came into the room. They're like, "What the fuck's wrong? What the fuck's wrong?" And I can't remember what I said because I was in such a state that I didn't know where I was, and I couldn't trust anybody. And I became very, very violent in that moment. It's very, very scary, man. It's not a place I ever want to go back to in my mind. But this was really the beginning of the real torture of what institutionalization brought to me. And it was really, really scary. And then, like I said, I went to my friend's place for a couple of days prior to going into Henwood. And, him being a con and in jail, there was some violence that was going to happen towards him because just on site, they thought that he was a child molester, and he was not a child molester. He was actually in jail for this particular person. He was actually in jail for not paying insurance, not paying his insurance, and he couldn't pay the fine. So they basically put him in jail in order to do the time for his fine. And, so because of the situation, he felt, I guess, that he owed me. So he gave me a couple days staying at his place and gave me a ride to the treatment center, Henwood, that I went to. And so I got to Henwood and I was really scared, because I didn't know what the hell was going to happen after Henwood. Henwood taught me amazing a skill set that I did not possess before. It was a very short program. And I think the only reason, I've said this before, the only real reason why it stuck for me was because I had abstinence time, and the amount of abstinence time I had prior to going to treatment, which really, really helped with allowing all these skills that they gave me at Henwood to really sink into my head. I also remember as I'm ready to graduate, air quotes, this treatment center and leave, I had nowhere to go. And so my counselor at Henwood actually, he did me a solid and backed me up to go to a halfway house after treatment. That wasn't really going to take me. And I went to that treatment center, and I did fairly well in that place. It didn't work out, and I ended up leaving long of the short of it. But I think at this point, I'm going to touch and press upon what probation looked like for me at this time. So I was basically on house arrest conditions. I had conditions for my first time being arrested, and I still had conditions on this time of being arrested. So basically, I had two sets of conditions that my probation officer could utilize at any time. My probation officer started off in Leduc, and then when I went to Henwood, I ended up switching because I was going to live in Edmonton after Henwood. And so therefore I ended up switching probation offices from Leduc County to Edmonton area. And I thought that I was going to get the old probation officer that I had. However, I got a new probation officer, which was probably much better. And as I was going through this probation process, my conditions were so strict that it was even difficult for me to work because I had to work at certain times. And then finally, I guess, my probation officer cut me a little bit of slack. And when they cut me a little bit of slack, I was really able to exceed what anybody's expectations were in regards to reforming. The halfway house really helped me to reform because they utilized the big book, like Big Book or the 12-step programs in my everyday life. So it allowed me to utilize the skills that had came to me from Henwood in a real way with the enforcement of what the halfway house was also suggesting. So treatment and halfway house basically were helping. Basically, treatment was the theory. The halfway house helped me with the practice of what the theory is, or the theory was coming from that skill set while utilizing a 12-step program, which worked out very, very well for me, even though I didn't graduate that particular halfway house. Now, all the while with probation, I made or got a really good rapport with my probation officer. When I was kicked out of that halfway house, I ended up going to that same guy who allowed me to stay with him for the couple days prior to treatment. I ended up staying with him for about 2 or 3 weeks. And he said to me, he goes, Justin, you don't have to pay me rent. Just save your money so you can get your own place. Me and this other, how would I say, like another client from the halfway house, we ended up going 50-50 or becoming roommates on another apartment. And as that was going on, I still had to deal with probation, and I had to go every 60 days to the probation office in order to appease my probation. I stayed within the rules. I mean, I'd never breached my probation order, and I did what I had to, and I was really free. For the most part, I got to do whatever I wanted to do. I couldn't leave the city or anything of that sort. But I was able to work when I wanted. I could do what I needed to do, and my restrictions weren't that bad. And then I remember in all of this time, so let's put a time frame on. It was about 2 or 3 years at this point that I had been released. I was waiting for trial still to sentence out because I was basically on bail probation. And with bail conditions of house arrest, air quotes. So as loose house arrest is what I was on. And so I was allowed to be out during the daytime, and I had a curfew and all of that stuff, but nobody was really checking on me. I think the big reason for that was my probation officer actually had a really good rapport with me. And then when I went to sentence out, I was really afraid to have to go back to jail. I've talked about this before in previous episodes where I got a really good deal. I got 2 years house arrest and 2 years probation when I was finally all done. Like my sentencing started off though at 14 years. And I had said earlier in the show that one of these particular charges that I was charged, I was overcharged with a possession of the purpose, and I was not selling drugs that day. I did ended up pleading out to 1 possession for the purpose charge, 2 gun charges, and then a possession charge of crack cocaine. And that's because the second one, I was not selling drugs that day. So they couldn't, my lawyer was not about to allow himself to be perjured, knowing that I had not committed that crime. And also if I had pled guilty to that particular charge, I would have ended up having to go into a federal system for more time, which was a 3-year minimum mandatory sentence. And that probably wouldn't have been good for me. I mean, I was already out on bail for basically 2 or 3 years prior to that. And so basically my lawyer did a really good job and got me a minimum he got me a house arrest sentence for possession for the purpose and some gun charges and possession charge. And so I remember having to go to probation in order to change my probation officer, because now I was in a new section called sentenced, right? So I remember at this time when getting my new probation officer for my sentencing stuff, how quick she was to just be all over me. She didn't believe anything I had said. All of the rapport that I had built with the previous probation officer basically went to the wayside, and I was starting all over again. I remember actually asking this probation officer, I said, what's the likelihood that I'm not going to go back to jail? I mean, really, my future is in your hands, and how quick is it or what's the success rate, I think is what I said, in people completing their house arrest probation with her. And I think she was a little bit upset when I said that, because I'm kind of, I guess at that point, suggesting to her that a lot of people might not make it through because she was a bitch. But she really wasn't. I think the reality is that she doesn't quite see many people who actually reform. She sees more people who are just trying to fuck with the system in order to get out of their house arrest and try to get out of their house as much as possible and use the system to the best advantages for them. And I'm not going to say, what I did do was anytime that I needed to get out, I always told her that I had business for this or that, which was legitimate reasons for me to leave my house at that time. And so on I went through that sentencing period, and the next year wasn't so bad. However, the first year through house arrest, what really ended up happening was I ended up getting agoraphobia pretty bad, man. Like I didn't leave my house I legally was not allowed to leave my house very often. And this encumbered me to a place in my own mind that was very similar and relative to being in the cell. And I found comfort in the fact that I was in my own house, although I was basically doing solitary confinement. That is basically what house arrest is. I mean, I didn't have anybody living with me at that time. And when it came to my incarceration, I mean, it was for sure better than being in the jail. I mean, being in the jail, you're subject to violence all of the time. And I think I painted a pretty clear picture earlier in this podcast about what it was like in even just a provincial system like Fort Saskatchewan Correctional Center, the abuse that went on into that place. So eventually I got to probation, and once I got to the probation series of things, I again had to get another probation officer and build a whole new rapport. Even in the time of my house arrest, there was a serious amount of time where, telephone call. Well, actually throughout the entire time, I get the telephone calls late at night, and I would get, spot checks in the house. I remember being near the end of all of that thinking, boy, I can't wait to not have to have my cell phone in my room so that I could actually get a night full of sleep without having to worry if my phone rang, because that would dictate right away that I was going back to incarceration. I mean, essentially, house arrest is incarcerated in the public. I remember at one time I did miss a phone call, and fortunately, my lawyer for another concern that I was a part of, a not-for-profit that lawyer was actually in the room, and he basically made the statement like, yeah, he was around me, and yeah, he was like, the phone was on silent, and he was actually in a meeting working. So that hashed its way pretty good. But I think for anybody else that they may have used that against them and put them back in jail pretty quickly because of those things. I think also in that moment when I realized that particular probation officer was giving me, I would say, benefit of the doubt in the things that I was doing, this was because she recognized that I was reforming, and I recognized also that I was reforming. And this was kind of a big deal. She couldn't believe some of the people that I was talking to, even in regards to being on probation. And I was pretty blown away also. I mean, in this time I was talking to the Premier of Alberta, which was Rachel Notley, unfortunately, at that time. And I was also talking to like the minister, like Sarah Hoffman, who is unfortunately the Minister of Health at that time as well. And trying to get in touch with the Solicitor General. I forget who that was, but I ended up not actually talking to him, and talking to his lackeys underneath him, which was very undeveloped with some of the projects I was bringing to the table. However, as I was talking about being incarcerated in the back of this agoraphobia, the PTSD that really came from all of that sentencing was atrocious. I mean, it still really plays a role in my life today when I come up to release dates, or if I come up to sentencing dates, or any of those, anniversary air quote times. I can definitely feel my PTSD flare up. It's almost like it's a inside intuition about, yeah, you were here at this time and this is when it happened. And there was also times in my early release where I would actually think that being incarcerated was better than being out in public. And this was because there's really no stress in jail, really, aside from once you combat the people who are around you, your time is pretty easy. I mean, in regards to like always having to show your asshole because some motherfucker asks you to do that. Outside of that, I mean, everything is pretty pretty good. However, the biggest stress that's constantly running through you is, when are you getting strip searched next? When are you getting your cell or house tossed? When are these things going to happen? You never really know. Therefore, you're always anticipating and expecting it to happen, as well as maybe one of the inmates will crack off and, like, fuck your world up a little bit. And so you always have to be cautious of these things. But outside of that, I mean, you don't have to worry about bills. You don't have to worry about getting fed. You don't have to worry about your housing or any of that stuff. So, I mean, there's definitely a pro and con list to jail. And I guess I'm kind of currently downplaying what because it's literally like that. Like, I'm downplaying a little bit of what that picture was like when I was in the Fort Saskatchewan Correctional Center. But you kind of forget that's what was happening with me when I started thinking about, shit, jail might be easier. And then I was like, holy fuck, like, you're pretty crazy to think that it's time to go back to jail at this point. But I also recognized in that moment, when I was early released, that I was still thinking in regards or in terms of a convict or being institutionalized, and recognizing that it might be easier to be in the institution than it would be out in the free world. And this is what I've been saying the entire time throughout this topic or / theme, is that it really, really sucks when you recognize how deep the institutionalization is within you. It's been years since I've been in jail, and I still have PTSD issues where if I wake up late at night, I need to make sure I walk out into fresh air that's breathing, like passing on my face, so that I know that I am free, or else all of a sudden I feel like I'm still incarcerated, and I will think that I'm actually back in my cell. It's a very, very scary feeling for me. The real time is in the perpetuation of that PTSD. And I remember there was a guy who was beat up so bad in the remand center. They squashed his head like a watermelon. And the blood was probably about 3 inches thick, and the smell of iron was just like, it stayed with you for days and days after that. I mean, the guards were literally watching these people kick this guy's head in like a fucking soccer ball, and it was horrific. It was a very horrific scene. And these are the things that you live with. And of course, again, I'm sure there are people out there who are saying, you do the crime, you got to do the time, and this is what goes with that. And sure, I mean, I guess to some regard in a remand center it is. However, we shouldn't be sitting in a remand center for 2 or 3 years waiting for trial. This is what is conducive towards an environment of the violence that I had just stated, is these people crammed into like sardines into these big supermax fucking jails where there's 2,800 people in a single place. I mean, that's an entire town. It's a Canadian town that's waiting. They're innocent people waiting to go to trial, really, in that moment. And that it's just not conducive to anything that's really positive or changing anybody's lifestyle. The real sentence in all of this out of corrections is the fact that the PTSD it's a sentence of life after you leave jail. That institutionalization is a sentence of life. It never really leaves you. And prison is always something that you'll reflect upon. As much as you want to forget about it, there's always a glimmer where the thought comes back like, oh my God, I remember being in that place and eating this food. And there's some foods I still can't even eat now. Like, I hate peanut butter and jam because that's what they gave us all of the time. I mean, our diet in that in any of the institutions in Alberta is basically a loaf of bread a day with 3 hot squares outside of that. And on the weekends, you only get 2 hot meals a day. I mean, it's pretty... I think anybody who is in the legal system, especially lawyers, crown attorneys, I really hope that they listen to this episode so they can understand the consequences that come from sentencing. I'm not saying that they need to start second guessing the amount of sentencing or the amount of time they sentence out to people. But what I'm suggesting is understand the depth and the weight of that sentence, really, because I think, and I've said this many times before, the overlook or the oversight that one doesn't recognize as a real punishment is the fact of the institutionalization itself. And then when you hear the horror stories of what the guards had also put upon us in the institution that I was in, I mean, I'll put my hand on a Bible all day long. I've worked very hard for my credibility and my integrity, and I'm not willing at this point to throw that all away on a bunch of lies. I mean, you can believe me or you don't have to believe me about what happened to me in Fort Saskatchewan Correctional Center. But truthfully, at the end of the day, I don't give a fuck what you believe. That was my experience. And what I'm saying is those people who are in that mode of sentencing really might want to take a look at just what is punishment itself. Because in my opinion, the lack of being a part of society, the lack of being a part of your family, the lack of readily accessibility in order to speak to your family, the fact of having to lock up when you're told, treated like a child, all of these things, this is punishment. The fact of sentencing, the fact of the institutionalization is all a part of the sentencing. There needs not to be anything superimposed upon these offenders outside of the scope of what the government has decided is punishment. I mean, Liam and I had spoke before that the government acts as the punisher, the accused, the victim, air quotes, and also the persecutor. So they're all three in one, right? So when we recognize that, we have to also recognize that this also festers almost a mentality, or it continues to fester this mentality of us versus them. And this is, in my opinion, why there's really no true reform. You know, it's very, very unfortunate that this is where we come to as a society, is where we impose more upon a person as opposed to just allowing it to be what it is. You know, and I think this is why you have so many people who end up becoming repeat offenders. And this is why we need to start utilizing groups and start looking at transitional periods from institution into actual society through the means of some sort of support group or some sort of support mentors, so on and so forth. However, I believe that this needs to be, in my strongest opinion, that this needs to be at a voluntary capacity. This cannot be done with the government meddling by paying people as like peer support workers or something of this nature. It just doesn't work that way, because some people are just bound and determined in order to stay in that old mentality of us versus them, and I'm going to get mine, and I'm taking from the government. I can tell you today that I truly do not have those philosophies in me any longer. I mean, I'm here to basically talk about a portion of my life that was not easy. I did express serious emotion throughout this hour about how deep that institutionalization was. And I really hope that what I hit home and impress upon you is, when we're done our time, we're done. That's it. That's all. We should not have to continuously pay for the crimes that we have committed. They're mistakes. You know, I heard in a movie a little while ago, people don't go to jail for mistakes. Well, the reality is people go to jail all the time for mistakes, because that's exactly what it was. Nobody wanted to wake up and be a drug addict. Nobody wanted to wake up and become a drug dealer. Nobody wanted to wake up and become a gangster. It kind of just happened. You know, it just happened. And that's the reality of anybody who commits a crime. There is not many crimes out there that are premeditated. You know, most crimes are crimes of service, you know, pimping, drug dealing, and small minor property offenses. Those are the crimes that are the majority out there. This ideology that there's gangsters everywhere, and that's just not real. That's not a reality. There's a very small amount of real gangsters, especially in the Canadian realm of things. So that's my story about what reform looked like for me, as honest and as unbiased as I could have possibly been, I think. I really hope that it hits home for you, and I really, really hope that it's thought provocative, and I hope that you have yourself a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And talk to you in the second week, talk to you in July. Have yourself a wonderful weekend, and bye for now.